Before I tell you how one business card completely shattered my arrogant daughter-in-law's assumptions and turned her world upside down, please hit that like button and subscribe to support the channel. Also, drop a comment telling me about a time when someone dismissed you because of your age, appearance, or eating habits, only to discover they had completely underestimated who they were dealing with. Your stories inspire these videos, and I read every single comment because I believe everyone deserves to be heard and respected, regardless of what others assume about their capabilities or social standing. But to understand the full impact of what happened that October evening when Vanessa told me I should eat my meals in my room, you need to know how those 4 months of apparent food obsession and social embarrassment had been carefully orchestrated from the very first day I moved into their house. Every excessive portion, every moment of seeming social unawareness, every instance of apparent inability to control my appetite had been strategically designed to reveal the true character of the people who claimed to love me. It all began in June, when I called David with news that would set everything in motion. "David, sweetheart, I've run into some serious financial trouble," I said, letting my voice carry just the right mixture of embarrassment and vulnerability as I spoke into the phone. "The restaurant where I've been working part-time has closed down, and my landlord is raising the rent on my apartment by 40%. I'm not sure I can afford to stay here much longer." The truth was that I had never worked part-time at any restaurant as an employee. I had never lived in a rental apartment that was subject to someone else's pricing decisions. And I certainly wasn't experiencing any financial difficulties that would require me to depend on my family's generosity. But David didn't need to know that the restaurant job was actually my role as the silent majority owner of Morrison's Family Kitchens, or that my apartment was a luxury condominium in Seattle's most exclusive building that I owned outright, along with 3 other units in the same complex. "Mom, that's terrible. Are you okay? Do you need help with the rent? Should I talk to the landlord?" David's immediate concern was genuine, and for a moment I felt a familiar pang of guilt about the deception I was about to begin. No, sweetheart, I don't want to be a burden. But I was wondering, would it be possible for me to stay with you and Vanessa for a few months? Just until I can find a more affordable place and maybe get another job. I know it's an imposition, but I'm running out of options. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear Vanessa's voice in the background asking what was wrong. David explained the situation quickly, and I listened carefully to their hurried conversation about whether they had space, what it would mean for their routines, and how long a few months might actually be. "Of course, Mom," David finally said, though I could hear the slight hesitation in his voice that told me this invitation was more about family obligation than genuine enthusiasm. "You can stay in the guest room as long as you need. When do you want to come over? Would next week be too soon? I hate to impose, but the landlord wants an answer about the rent increase by Friday, and I need to decide whether to pay it or start looking for somewhere else to live." "Next week is fine, Mom. Don't worry about being an imposition. You're family." But even as David said those words, I could hear the strain in his voice that told me this arrangement was going to be more challenging than he wanted to admit. That tone would become crucial evidence in the months ahead. The following Monday, I arrived at David and Vanessa's house with 2 modest suitcases and a carefully curated collection of personal items that would support the image I wanted to project. An elderly woman who was grateful for family support, but perhaps not entirely aware of the social expectations that came with living in someone else's household. "Eleanor, you look tired," Vanessa said when she opened the door, and her concern appeared genuine. "This whole situation must be so stressful for you. Come in, and let's get you settled." "I can't tell you how much I appreciate this," I replied, allowing my voice to carry the slightly overwhelmed tone of someone who was genuinely dependent on others' generosity. "I promise I'll try not to be any trouble." Vanessa immediately began showing me around their house, explaining household routines, pointing out where everything was located, and describing their family schedules. Her helpfulness seemed sincere, but I was already taking mental notes about her assumptions and expectations regarding my role in their household. "Now, Eleanor, we usually eat dinner around 6:30, and breakfast is pretty casual. Everyone just gets what they want from the kitchen. Lunch is usually light, maybe leftovers or sandwiches. Is that schedule okay for you?" "Oh yes, dear, that sounds perfect. I'm used to simple meals. I don't want to be any trouble." But even as I said those words, I was already planning exactly what kind of trouble I would become, and how I would use their responses to that trouble to learn everything I needed to know about their true character when dealing with elderly family members whose behavior didn't match their expectations. The guest room was lovely, decorated in warm colors with a comfortable bed, a reading chair by the window, and its own attached bathroom. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a perfectly pleasant place to stay. But for the experiment I was about to conduct, it would serve as my base of operations for the most comprehensive character assessment I had ever undertaken. Over the first week, I gradually introduced small signs of what would appear to be a developing preoccupation with food that would test their patience and reveal their attitudes toward elderly family members who seemed to lack appropriate social awareness. I started by taking slightly larger portions at dinner than seemed appropriate for someone my age and size, lingering over meals longer than the family was accustomed to, and asking questions about recipes and cooking methods that went beyond normal dinner conversation. "Vanessa, this chicken is absolutely delicious. What cooking method did you use?" I would ask, even though I could identify the technique immediately from taste, texture, and appearance. "Thank you, Eleanor. I just roasted it in the oven with some herbs and vegetables." "Roasted at what temperature, and for how long?" "The texture suggests you might have brined it first, or perhaps used a specific seasoning technique that I haven't encountered before." Vanessa would glance at David with a slightly puzzled expression, clearly wondering why I was asking such detailed technical questions about a simple roasted chicken dinner. "I think it was around 375 degrees for maybe an hour. I didn't do anything special to it." "Interesting. The flavor profile suggests some very sophisticated seasoning choices. Did you use fresh herbs or dried? And what type of oil or fat for the roasting process?" Quote, "These detailed culinary conversations allowed me to observe how quickly Vanessa's patience wore thin when dealing with someone who seemed to have an inappropriately intense interest in food preparation details during what should have been casual family dinner conversation. I also began demonstrating what appeared to be poor portion control and social awareness around food, taking seconds before others had finished their first serving, reaching across the table for dishes instead of asking for them to be passed, and making appreciative sounds while eating that seemed excessive for polite company. "Oh my, this is so good," I would say while savoring each bite with obvious enthusiasm. "I haven't had food this delicious in such a long time. Would it be possible to have just a little more?" "Of course, Eleanor," Vanessa would reply, but I noted the slight tightness in her voice that suggested she was already finding my eating behavior somewhat inappropriate for someone who should understand basic dinner table etiquette. During the second week, I escalated my apparent food-related issues by appearing in the kitchen at unusual hours to prepare what seemed like unnecessarily elaborate snacks, rearranging items in the refrigerator and pantry to accommodate my personal food preferences, and making specific requests about grocery shopping that seemed disproportionate to my supposed financial limitations. "Vanessa, dear, I noticed you're planning to go grocery shopping tomorrow. Would it be possible to add a few items to your list?" I would ask, then proceed to request expensive specialty ingredients, gourmet delicacies, and imported products that clearly strained their household budget, but which I claimed were essential for my dietary needs. "Eleanor, some of these items are quite expensive," Vanessa would say carefully. "Are they really necessary? We could probably find less expensive alternatives that would work just as well." "Oh, I understand they're a bit costly, but I have very specific dietary requirements based on my health conditions. My doctor says these particular ingredients are important for maintaining my energy levels and digestion at my age." These conversations allowed me to observe how Vanessa handled financial stress related to my presence in their household, and whether she would prioritize my apparent needs over their budget constraints, or find diplomatic ways to manage my requests without creating conflict. I also began demonstrating what appeared to be inappropriate social behavior around food when they had guests, taking larger portions than seemed reasonable, asking detailed questions about catering arrangements, and offering unsolicited advice about menu planning and food service that made their friends and colleagues uncomfortable. During David's colleagues' dinner party, I made sure to engage their guests in detailed conversations about restaurant preferences, food quality standards, and culinary trends that went far beyond normal social chit-chat. "Have you tried the new restaurant that opened in Belltown?" I would ask one of David's law partners. "I was there last week, and I have some concerns about their food safety protocols. The temperature of their soup course was inconsistent, and their salad preparation suggested some questionable handling procedures. The attorney would exchange glances with his wife, clearly wondering why David's mother was providing such detailed critiques of restaurant operations and expressing concerns that seemed to require professional knowledge to assess accurately. I also noticed some issues with their supplier relationships, I would continue. The quality of their protein suggests they're not working with top-tier vendors, and their pricing structure indicates some cost-cutting measures that could affect long-term sustainability. These interactions allowed me to document how David and Vanessa responded when my behavior created social awkwardness for their professional relationships, and whether they would prioritize their guests' comfort over my apparent need to share my food-related knowledge and opinions. As the third week progressed, I introduced what appeared to be more serious boundary issues around food and social situations, including correcting their friends' assumptions about cooking methods, offering detailed critiques of restaurant service during group outings, and demonstrating knowledge of food industry operations that seemed inappropriate for someone in my supposed circumstances. Actually, that restaurant uses pre-prepared sauces rather than making them fresh, I would interject during conversations about local dining options. Their cost structure requires them to use industrial suppliers for most of their flavor components, which explains the consistency but reduces the authenticity of their cuisine. Quote, Vanessa would shoot David meaningful glances that clearly communicated her growing concern about my tendency to dominate food-related conversations with technical information that seemed both inappropriate and unnecessarily critical of establishments where they regularly entertain clients and colleagues. During restaurant visits, I made sure to engage servers in detailed conversations about kitchen operations, supplier relationships, and preparation methods that went far beyond normal customer curiosity. Could you tell me about your protein sourcing? I would ask servers who were clearly unprepared for such technical questions. I'm particularly interested in your aging processes for the beef and your handling protocols for the seafood. Also, what's your rotation schedule for inventory management? These interactions created visible discomfort for David and Vanessa, who had to apologize to restaurant staff for my apparently inappropriate questions while trying to maintain their own relationships with establishments where they were regular customers. By the end of the third week, I had established a comprehensive pattern of apparent food-related behavioral problems that tested every aspect of their willingness to accommodate an elderly family member whose social awareness seemed to be declining in ways that affected their own comfort and reputation. I had observed their responses to unusual eating habits, inappropriate social behavior, expensive requests, and boundary-crossing interactions that revealed their true attitudes about elderly family members who didn't conform to their expectations of appropriate behavior. What I discovered was that neither David nor Vanessa had any real tolerance for elderly family members whose behavior created inconvenience or embarrassment for their carefully maintained social image. They viewed my apparent food obsessions as problems to be managed rather than quirks to be accepted. They spoke to me with increasing impatience when my behavior didn't match their standards, and they made decisions about managing my conduct without ever asking what I needed or wanted. During the fourth week, their private conversations began to focus on strategies for controlling my behavior, rather than understanding why I might be acting differently than they expected. We need to set some boundaries about the food situation, I overheard Vanessa tell David one evening after I had apparently embarrassed them at a dinner party by asking their guests detailed questions about their restaurant preferences and offering critiques of local establishments. I know she's your mother, but her behavior around food is becoming a real problem for our social life. People are starting to ask questions about her background and whether she has some kind of eating disorder or cognitive issues. Maybe we should talk to her doctor about it, David replied. There might be medications or behavioral strategies that could help her understand appropriate social boundaries around food and eating. Their conversation revealed that they were already planning to medicalize my behavior rather than simply accepting that I might have different interests and knowledge than they expected from an elderly family member. They were looking for ways to change me rather than adapt to my presence in their household. This was exactly the evidence I needed to understand how my family would treat me if I actually needed their support and acceptance. They would provide accommodation reluctantly, with resentment and attempts to control my behavior to minimize inconvenience for their own lives. During my final weeks of preparation for the ultimate test, I began leaving subtle hints about my real situation, making brief phone calls that suggested business activities, receiving mail that indicated financial complexity beyond their assumptions, and occasionally demonstrating knowledge that contradicted their conclusions about my background and capabilities. But David and Vanessa were so convinced of their interpretation of my behavior that they explained away any evidence that challenged their assumptions. When I demonstrated detailed knowledge about restaurant operations, they assumed I was remembering information from old cooking shows rather than current professional experience. When I received business correspondence, they assumed it was routine paperwork about modest financial accounts rather than communication about substantial business holdings. Their inability to see past their own assumptions about elderly behavior and food-related issues revealed how completely they had dismissed me as someone worthy of respect and consideration. They had decided I was becoming an embarrassment, and they interpreted everything I said or did through that lens, never considering that their elderly mother-in-law might be far more capable and knowledgeable than they realized. And that's what made the moment of revelation so perfectly devastating when it finally arrived. David and Vanessa had spent 4 months demonstrating exactly how they treated elderly family members they believed were becoming social liabilities. They had shown their true character when they thought no one was keeping score, and they had revealed their priorities when they believed their decisions couldn't be challenged. The business card I would eventually place on their dining room table contained documentation that would prove not only that every assumption they had made about my background was wrong, but that their treatment of me had been observed, evaluated, and found completely inadequate by someone who had the power to change their lives in ways they never imagined possible. Because the most important tests of character aren't the ones people know they're taking, they're the ones that reveal who someone really is when they think their choices don't have consequences, and their assumptions about other people's worth can't be challenged by inconvenient truths about power, capability, and respect. To truly understand the devastating impact of what would happen when Vanessa discovered the truth about my capabilities and connections, you need to see the world exactly as she and David saw it during those 4 months. You need to understand how reasonable their assumptions seemed, how logical their concerns appeared, and how completely convinced they were that they were dealing with an elderly woman whose relationship with food had become problematic in ways that reflected deeper issues with aging, social awareness, and possibly cognitive decline. From Vanessa's perspective, she was watching her mother-in-law experience what appeared to be a classic case of age-related behavioral changes that manifested through an increasingly inappropriate relationship with food and social boundaries. Everything she observed seemed to confirm the research she had done about elderly eating disorders, loss of social inhibition, and the ways that aging could affect judgment and self-awareness in social situations. When Vanessa looked at me reaching for third helpings at dinner parties, she didn't see a successful restaurant owner conducting professional quality assessments. She saw an elderly woman whose ability to gauge appropriate portion sizes had been compromised by age-related changes in metabolism, medication effects, or possibly early-stage dementia that was affecting her understanding of social norms and personal boundaries. When she watched me examine dishes with intense concentration, asking detailed questions about ingredients and preparation methods, she didn't see someone with 4 decades of professional culinary expertise. She saw cognitive fixation behavior that elderly individuals sometimes develop when their ability to process complex social situations becomes limited, causing them to focus obsessively on concrete, tangible details like food as a way to feel more in control of their environment. The enthusiastic sounds I made while eating weren't the responses of someone who had spent a lifetime developing a sophisticated palate and genuine appreciation for culinary artistry. They were embarrassing displays of diminished social awareness that suggested I had lost the ability to monitor my own behavior and understand how others might perceive my actions in polite company. My apparent inability to recognize when I had taken more than my fair share wasn't strategic testing of their character. It was evidence of the kind of self-centeredness that can develop in elderly individuals whose cognitive abilities are declining and whose capacity for empathy and social awareness has been compromised by age-related brain changes that affect judgment and consideration for others. From Vanessa's perspective, my midnight kitchen activities weren't the work sessions of a successful business owner. They were concerning examples of the sleep disruption and restless behavior that often accompany aging, possibly indicating anxiety, confusion about daily routines, or the kind of repetitive behaviors that can develop when elderly individuals feel displaced or uncertain about their role in a household. When I rearranged items in their refrigerator or made specific requests about food storage and preparation, Vanessa saw controlling behavior that reflected an elderly person's attempt to maintain some sense of authority and relevance in a household where they no longer had a clear role or purpose. She interpreted my detailed instructions about food handling as the kind of micromanaging that can develop when elderly individuals feel powerless in other areas of their lives. My extensive comments about restaurant quality and service weren't the professional observations of someone who had built a successful culinary empire. They were the complaints and criticisms that elderly individuals sometimes develop when their ability to adapt to changing standards and expectations becomes limited, causing them to judge everything by outdated standards and memories of how things used to be. The expensive specialty ingredients I purchased during grocery trips weren't investments in professional recipe development. They were examples of the poor financial judgment that can affect elderly individuals whose understanding of money management and budget priorities has been compromised by cognitive changes, or by the kind of impulsive spending that sometimes develops when people feel they have limited time left to enjoy life's pleasures. When Vanessa observed me at social gatherings, engaging servers in detailed conversations about kitchen operations and supplier relationships, she saw inappropriate boundary-crossing behavior that suggested I had lost the ability to understand professional hierarchies and social contexts. She interpreted my technical questions as the kind of intrusive curiosity that can develop when elderly individuals become socially isolated and treat every interaction as an opportunity for excessive personal connection. My corrections of other people's assumptions about cooking methods weren't demonstrations of professional expertise. They were examples of the argumentative behavior that can develop in elderly individuals whose cognitive flexibility has decreased, making them more rigid in their thinking and more likely to correct others inappropriately, rather than engaging in the kind of diplomatic conversation that social situations require. From Vanessa's perspective, my detailed knowledge of restaurant industry trends and business practices wasn't evidence of current professional involvement. It was the kind of outdated information that elderly individuals sometimes retain from decades past, mixed with confusion about current realities, and an inability to distinguish between memories of past experiences and current knowledge about how industries operate. When I offered unsolicited advice about menu planning and food service operations, Vanessa didn't see strategic consultation from someone with current industry expertise. She saw the inappropriate advice giving that can develop when elderly individuals feel their experience and knowledge are being ignored, leading them to insert themselves into conversations and situations where their input is neither requested nor relevant. My intense interest in food costs and vendor relationships wasn't professional market research. It was the kind of inappropriate curiosity about other people's financial affairs that can develop when elderly individuals become anxious about money or lose the social awareness that should prevent them from asking invasive questions about budgets and business relationships. The detailed feedback I provided about catering and restaurant experiences wasn't valuable professional assessment. It was excessive criticism that reflected an elderly person's inability to enjoy experiences without constant comparison to past standards, possibly indicating depression, dissatisfaction with their current circumstances, or the kind of negative thinking patterns that can develop when people feel their lives are no longer as rich and meaningful as they once were. When Vanessa watched me interact with restaurant staff, asking specific questions about suppliers and preparation techniques, she saw behavior that crossed professional boundaries and suggested I didn't understand the difference between being a customer and being inappropriately involved in business operations. She interpreted my technical vocabulary as pretentious language that I had picked up from cooking shows or food magazines, rather than authentic professional knowledge. My ability to identify specific ingredients and cooking techniques wasn't evidence of professional expertise. It was the kind of detailed food knowledge that some elderly individuals develop as a hobby or obsession when they have too much time and too few meaningful activities to occupy their minds. Vanessa assumed I had become one of those elderly people who watch excessive amounts of Food Network programming and develop unrealistic ideas about their own culinary sophistication. The modifications I requested at restaurants weren't professional-level customizations based on industry knowledge. They were the difficult demands that elderly customers sometimes make when they become inflexible about their preferences and lose the social awareness that should prevent them from making complicated requests that inconvenience kitchen staff and other diners. When I expressed disappointment about food quality or service standards, Vanessa didn't hear legitimate professional critique. She heard the unrealistic expectations that can develop when elderly individuals become disconnected from current economic realities and judge everything by idealized memories of past experiences that may not have been as exceptional as they remember. My extensive recipe collections and detailed notes about cooking techniques weren't professional development materials. They were the obsessive hoarding behavior that can develop when elderly individuals feel the need to control and organize their environment in response to feelings of powerlessness or confusion about their changing role in the world. The cooking equipment I requested for their kitchen wasn't professional-grade tooling for serious culinary work. It was expensive equipment that reflected poor judgment about household budgets and the kind of impulsive purchasing that can develop when elderly individuals try to recapture feelings of competence and purpose through material acquisitions that don't align with their actual needs or abilities. When I demonstrated advanced cooking techniques or shared detailed knowledge about food chemistry and preparation science, Vanessa assumed I was repeating information I had memorized from cookbooks and television programs, rather than drawing on decades of hands-on professional experience. She interpreted my technical accuracy as the kind of rote learning that some elderly individuals pursue, as a way to feel intellectually engaged when their cognitive abilities in other areas are declining. My detailed critiques of restaurant business practices weren't informed professional analysis. They were the uninformed opinions that elderly individuals sometimes develop when they have too much time to think about industries they don't really understand, leading them to make sweeping judgments based on limited customer-level observations rather than actual business knowledge. The networking conversations I had with food service professionals weren't evidence of current industry connections. They were examples of elderly individuals trying to feel relevant and important by claiming associations with people and businesses that may have been peripheral connections decades ago, exaggerated over time into more significant relationships than actually existed. When I discussed food trends and market analysis with apparent expertise, Vanessa heard the kind of superficial knowledge that elderly individuals sometimes acquire through excessive reading of industry publications and food blogs, mistaking consumer-level information for professional insight, and failing to understand the difference between being well-informed about an industry and actually working in it successfully. My suggestions for improving catering arrangements and food service operations weren't valuable professional consultation. They were inappropriate interference from someone who didn't understand the difference between having opinions about food and having the qualifications to advise others about business operations in an industry they had never actually worked in professionally. The detailed questions I asked about food sourcing and supply chain management weren't professional research. They were intrusive curiosity that reflected poor social boundaries and the kind of inappropriate interest in other people's business operations that can develop when elderly individuals become socially isolated and treat every interaction as an opportunity for excessive personal involvement. When I demonstrated knowledge of food safety regulations and industry compliance requirements, Vanessa assumed I had become obsessive about food safety as a result of age-related anxiety about health and contamination, leading me to research and memorize regulations that had no relevance to my actual life or circumstances, but gave me a sense of control and expertise in an area where I felt competent. My ability to predict restaurant success and failure wasn't evidence of professional market analysis skills. It was the kind of pattern recognition that some elderly individuals develop when they have too much time to observe and analyze local businesses, combined with the tendency to remember their successful predictions while forgetting their incorrect assessments, creating an illusion of expertise that isn't based on actual professional knowledge. The detailed cost analyses I provided for food service operations weren't professional financial assessment. They were inappropriate curiosity about other people's business finances, combined with oversimplified calculations that reflected a consumer's perspective, rather than an understanding of the complex economic factors that actually determine restaurant profitability and sustainability. When I offered to introduce David and Vanessa to restaurant owners and food industry professionals, they assumed I was exaggerating casual acquaintanceships into more significant business relationships, the way elderly individuals sometimes inflate their social connections to feel more important and relevant than their actual circumstances would suggest. My detailed knowledge of restaurant real estate and location analysis wasn't evidence of professional development experience. It was information I had gathered through excessive research and observation as a way to feel intellectually engaged with an industry that interested me as a consumer rather than as someone with actual professional involvement in site selection and business development. The specific advice I gave about menu pricing and profit margins weren't professional consultation. They were oversimplified assumptions based on customer-level observations and magazine articles, reflecting the kind of surface-level understanding that elderly individuals sometimes develop when they mistake extensive reading for actual business experience. When I discussed chef training and culinary education with apparent authority, Vanessa heard the kind of secondhand knowledge that elderly individuals sometimes acquire through documentary viewing and food magazine subscriptions, mistaking consumer-level information about the industry for actual understanding of professional development and career progression in culinary arts. My critiques of food photography and restaurant marketing weren't professional media analysis. They were opinions based on extensive consumer exposure to food advertising and social media content, reflecting the kind of detailed observation that can develop when elderly individuals have too much time to analyze and criticize commercial content without understanding the professional considerations that shape marketing decisions. The detailed information I shared about food festivals and industry events wasn't evidence of professional participation. It was extensive research I had conducted as an interested consumer who had become obsessive about following industry news and developments, creating an appearance of insider knowledge that was actually based on public information and media coverage rather than professional involvement. When I demonstrated knowledge of food production and agricultural sourcing, Vanessa assumed I had developed an elderly person's hobby-level interest in farming and food production, possibly as a way to feel connected to traditional values and simpler times, rather than understanding that this knowledge came from decades of professional supplier relationships and quality control experience. My ability to identify specific brands and suppliers wasn't evidence of professional purchasing experience. It was the kind of detailed consumer knowledge that some elderly individuals develop when they become obsessive about product research and brand comparison as a way to feel competent and informed in an increasingly complex marketplace. The financial projections I made for restaurant ventures weren't professional business analysis. They were simplified calculations based on consumer-level observations and assumptions, reflecting the kind of oversimplified understanding that elderly individuals sometimes develop when they mistake casual interest in an industry for actual business expertise. All of these observations led Vanessa to a conclusion that seemed completely logical and well supported by evidence. I was an elderly woman whose cognitive abilities were declining in ways that made me inappropriate for social situations, whose relationship with food had become problematic and embarrassing, and whose claims about industry knowledge and professional connections were either exaggerated memories from decades past or compensatory fantasies designed to make me feel more important and relevant than my actual circumstances would justify. From her perspective, the kindest interpretation was that I was experiencing the kind of age-related changes that affect judgment, social awareness, and self-control, requiring family intervention to protect both my dignity and their social standing. The most concerning interpretation was that I was developing cognitive impairment that was manifesting through obsessive behavior, poor social boundaries, and an inability to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate conduct in social situations. Either way, Vanessa believed she was dealing with an elderly family member whose behavior had become embarrassing and potentially harmful to the family's reputation, requiring careful management and possibly professional intervention to address what appeared to be serious behavioral problems that were affecting everyone involved. And that complete conviction, that absolute certainty that she understood my situation and was making appropriate judgments about my capabilities and behavior, was exactly what made the revelation that was coming so perfectly devastating when it finally arrived. "Eleanor, you eat too much, and it's embarrassing when we have guests over. Maybe you should consider eating your meals in your room from now on." That's what my daughter-in-law Vanessa declared right in front of my son David and my 2 grandchildren, completely unaware that the gluttonous old woman she was trying to shame into hiding was actually the silent owner of the restaurant chain that employed half their social circle, along with a food empire that generated more revenue in a single quarter than David's law practice earned in 5 years. But what Vanessa didn't know was that the simple business card I quietly placed on their dining room table contained information that would make her realize she had just made the most expensive comment about appetite and age in her entire life, one that would cost her the lifestyle she thought she was protecting from her embarrassing mother-in-law. My name is Eleanor Catherine Morrison, and I'm 70 years old. If you had walked into my son's elegant Tudor-style house in Seattle's Queen Anne neighborhood that rainy October evening, you would have seen exactly what Vanessa saw. An elderly woman who seemed to take unusually large portions at dinner, who always asked for seconds and sometimes thirds, who appeared to have an almost childlike enthusiasm for desserts and treats, and who seemed oblivious to the social cues that most adults understood about appropriate eating behavior in polite company. You would have watched me pile my plate high with David's expensive catered meals, reaching for bread rolls and side dishes with what appeared to be an embarrassing lack of self-control. You might have noticed how I seemed to savor every bite with an intensity that made others uncomfortable, closing my eyes and making small sounds of appreciation that drew awkward glances from dinner guests, who clearly found my behavior unseemly for a woman of my age and social position. You would have observed me cutting generous slices of cake, taking multiple pieces of hors d'oeuvre at cocktail parties, and asking detailed questions about recipes and ingredients that seemed inappropriately focused on the technical aspects of food preparation rather than polite social conversation. You might have seen me examine each dish with what appeared to be professional curiosity, commenting on flavor profiles, cooking techniques, and presentation details that most dinner guests would never notice or mention. If you had been there during the previous 4 months since I'd moved in after my supposed financial difficulties, you would have seen an elderly woman who seemed to treat their household like an all-you-can-eat buffet, who never seemed to feel full or satisfied no matter how much food was available, and who appeared to lack the basic social awareness that should have told her when her appetite was becoming a source of embarrassment for her family. You would have witnessed my apparent inability to recognize when I had taken more than my fair share, when my enthusiastic eating was drawing stares from other guests, or when my detailed commentary about food was making others uncomfortable. You might have seen me reach across the table for items that were closer to other diners, ask for specific dishes to be passed multiple times during a single meal, or request recipes from hostesses with what seemed like inappropriate persistence. During those 4 months, you would have observed what appeared to be an elderly woman whose relationship with food had become problematic in ways that reflected poorly on her upbringing, her current mental state, and her understanding of social boundaries. You might have watched me sneak into the kitchen at midnight to prepare elaborate snacks, rearrange items in the refrigerator to make room for my personal food purchases, or express disappointment when meals didn't meet my apparently unrealistic expectations. You would have seen Vanessa's growing mortification as she watched me at dinner parties with David's legal colleagues, charity fundraisers with their social circle, and family gatherings where my eating habits seemed to overshadow every conversation and create uncomfortable silences that made everyone question whether I was experiencing some form of age-related loss of inhibition or social awareness. At David's law firm's annual partner dinner, you might have witnessed me asking for thirds of the salmon course while other guests were still working on their first serving, or see me take multiple desserts from the buffet table, while making detailed comments about the pastry techniques that left the other attorneys' wives exchanging meaningful glances about my apparent lack of social refinement. During Vanessa's book club meetings, you would have observed me appearing in the kitchen during their discussions to prepare what seemed like unnecessarily elaborate snacks, then hovering around their gathering with plates of food that none of the other women had requested or wanted. You might have seen me offering detailed critiques of the catered refreshments they had ordered, suggesting improvements to recipes, or asking invasive questions about their food budgets and vendor choices. You would have watched me at neighborhood barbecues taking larger portions than seemed appropriate for someone my age and size, going back for seconds and thirds while children were still waiting to be served, and making comments about the quality of the food that seemed either inappropriately critical or embarrassingly enthusiastic depending on the circumstances. If you had been present during David and Vanessa's dinner parties, you would have seen me dominating conversations about restaurants, food trends, and culinary techniques in ways that seemed to make their guests uncomfortable. You might have noticed how I would correct their assumptions about cooking methods, offer unsolicited advice about menu planning, or share detailed opinions about local restaurants that went far beyond normal social commentary. You would have observed Vanessa's increasing frustration as she tried to manage my behavior around their friends and colleagues, gently suggesting that I moderate my portions, quietly discouraging me from taking multiple servings, and attempting to redirect conversations away from food-related topics when my enthusiasm became too intense for polite company. You might have seen David's growing embarrassment as he watched his mother's apparent lack of self-control around food affect his professional relationships and social standing. You would have witnessed his attempts to explain my behavior to confused friends, his apologies to hostesses whose events I had disrupted with my eating habits, and his increasingly desperate efforts to find ways to include me in family activities without creating social awkwardness. During the children's birthday parties and school events, you would have seen me taking what appeared to be inappropriate interest in the catering arrangements, asking detailed questions about food costs and preparation methods, and offering unsolicited suggestions about menu improvements that made other parents wonder about my background and current mental state. You might have observed me at grocery stores with Vanessa, filling shopping carts with what seemed like excessive quantities of specialty ingredients, expensive delicacies, and gourmet items that appeared to strain their household budget. You would have seen me examining products with what looked like professional scrutiny, reading ingredient lists with unusual intensity, and making purchasing decisions that seemed disproportionate to my supposed financial limitations. At restaurants, you would have watched me ordering multiple courses, asking detailed questions about preparation methods, and engaging servers in conversations about suppliers, ingredients, and cooking techniques that went far beyond normal customer curiosity. You might have seen me sending dishes back for minor adjustments, requesting specific modifications that seemed unnecessarily complicated, or leaving detailed feedback that suggested an uncomfortably intimate knowledge of professional kitchen operations. You would have witnessed Vanessa speaking to me in increasingly sharp tones about portion control, appropriate behavior, and setting a good example for the children, while I appeared confused by her concerns and defensive about what I saw as my right to eat however much I wanted in my son's house. You might have heard their whispered conversations about my food issues, their research into elderly eating disorders, and their growing concern that my behavior was becoming socially damaging for their family. During family dinners, you would have seen Vanessa carefully monitoring my plate, suggesting smaller portions, and attempting to redirect my attention away from food-related topics before I could embarrass the family with what appeared to be my obsessive interest in culinary details. You might have noticed how she would quickly clear serving dishes when I reached for second helpings, how she would change the subject when I began discussing restaurant experiences, or how she would make excuses to guests about my special dietary needs when my eating behavior became too noticeable. You would have observed David's internal conflict as he tried to balance his love for his mother with his growing concern about her impact on his family's social standing and professional relationships. You might have seen him attempting to have gentle conversations with me about moderation and social awareness, his research into programs for elderly individuals with eating problems, and his increasingly frequent discussions with Vanessa about strategies for managing my behavior. If you had been there during their private conversations, you would have heard Vanessa expressing her frustration about the impact my eating habits were having on their social life, their professional relationships, and their children's understanding of appropriate behavior. You might have listened to David's conflicted responses as he tried to defend his mother while acknowledging the legitimacy of his wife's concerns about the family's reputation and social standing. You would have witnessed their research into residential facilities that specialized in elderly individuals with behavioral problems, their consultations with geriatricians about age-related changes in appetite and social awareness, and their growing conviction that my eating habits represented a form of cognitive decline that might require professional intervention. During those 4 months, you would have seen what appeared to be a textbook case of an elderly family member whose relationship with food had become problematic in ways that affected not just her own health and dignity, but the entire family's social dynamics and professional relationships. You might have observed the emotional toll on David as he watched his mother's apparent decline, the practical stress on Vanessa as she tried to manage the social consequences of my behavior, and the confusion of the grandchildren as they tried to understand why their grandmother seemed so different from other elderly relatives. You would have watched Vanessa's attempts to find diplomatic solutions to what seemed like an impossible situation, her research into appropriate ways to address eating disorders in elderly individuals, and her growing conviction that professional intervention might be necessary to protect both my health and the family's social welfare. You might have seen David's guilt about potentially confronting his mother about her behavior, his research into family counseling services that specialized in elderly care issues, and his increasing belief that some form of structured intervention might be the only way to address what appeared to be a serious behavioral problem that was affecting everyone involved. But what you couldn't have seen, what you couldn't have imagined, and what you were about to discover in the most shocking way possible was that every single assumption they had made about my relationship with food, my financial situation, and my understanding of social dynamics was not just wrong. It was deliberately and strategically constructed to test exactly how they would treat an elderly family member they believed was becoming an embarrassment to their carefully curated lifestyle. The gluttonous old woman, who seemed to lack self-control around food, had actually spent 45 years building one of the most successful culinary empires in the Pacific Northwest. The elderly mother, who appeared to be freeloading off their generosity, was actually the founder and majority owner of Morrison's Family Kitchens, a restaurant chain that had grown from a single diner into 37 locations across Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. The woman, who seemed inappropriately obsessed with food quality and preparation, was actually one of the most respected figures in the regional restaurant industry, whose opinions about culinary trends and business practices were sought by food critics, industry publications, and culinary schools throughout the West Coast. The elderly family member, who appeared to be straining their household budget with her expensive food preferences, was actually someone whose monthly passive income from restaurant royalties exceeded David's annual salary as a senior partner in his law firm. And the simple business card I placed on their dining room table while Vanessa was explaining why I should eat my meals in isolation contained contact information that would prove I wasn't just passionate about food. I was the hidden force behind half the restaurants where they entertained their friends, the silent partner in the catering companies they used for their social events, and the strategic investor whose decisions about the local food industry could make or break the careers of everyone in their social circle. The detailed questions I asked about recipes weren't the ramblings of a confused elderly woman. They were the professional assessments of someone who had developed the signature dishes for dozens of successful restaurants. The technical comments I made about cooking methods weren't inappropriate social behavior. They were the expert observations of someone whose culinary innovations had influenced an entire generation of Pacific Northwest chefs. The excessive portions I took weren't evidence of poor self-control. They were the careful tastings of someone who was constantly evaluating food quality, analyzing preparation techniques, and assessing the competitive landscape of an industry I had helped to create. The midnight kitchen visits that seemed like problematic behavior were actually the working sessions of someone who was developing new menu concepts, testing recipe modifications, and maintaining the hands-on involvement that had made my restaurant empire successful. But before I reveal the contents of that business card and the moment when Vanessa's world turned upside down, you need to understand how I had reached this point, why I had chosen to test my family's character through their attitudes about food and social embarrassment, and what I had learned about their true values during those 4 months that would determine their future in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. Because sometimes the most important questions aren't about whether elderly people should control their appetites. They're about whether their families can accept them as they are when they think no one important is watching, and what happens when someone with real power decides to find out exactly who their loved ones really are when they believe their social status is at stake. As the second month of my residency in David and Vanessa's house began, I decided it was time to escalate my performance to levels that would truly test their character and reveal their authentic attitudes toward elderly family members whose behavior challenged their social comfort zones. The gentle probing of the first month had given me valuable baseline information about their tolerance levels, but I needed to push them significantly further to see who they really were when their patience, generosity, and family loyalty were genuinely tested. I began the escalation by introducing what appeared to be increasingly compulsive behavior around food that would require them to make difficult decisions about how to handle an elderly family member whose conduct was becoming genuinely disruptive to their household routines and social activities. The first major test came during Vanessa's monthly book club meeting, an elegant gathering of 12 professional women who met at rotating homes to discuss literature while enjoying carefully curated refreshments and wine pairings. Vanessa had been hosting this group for 3 years, and these meetings were important to her social standing and professional networking within Seattle's legal and business communities. On the morning of the book club meeting, I appeared in their kitchen at 6 a.m., well before anyone else in the household was awake, and began preparing what appeared to be an elaborate multi-course meal using expensive ingredients I had specifically requested during recent grocery trips. "Eleanor, what are you doing?" Vanessa asked when she discovered me 2 hours later, surrounded by multiple pots, pans, and serving dishes that covered every available counter space in her normally pristine kitchen. "I wanted to contribute something special for your book club ladies," I replied, gesturing toward an array of sophisticated appetizers, artisanal bread products, and complex desserts that clearly represented many hours of intensive preparation. "I know how important these gatherings are to you, and I thought your friends might enjoy some homemade alternatives to whatever catering you had planned." Vanessa stared at the chaos in her kitchen with obvious dismay. She had already arranged for professional catering from one of Seattle's most respected gourmet establishments, and my unsolicited contributions created both logistical and social complications that she was completely unprepared to handle. "Eleanor, this is very thoughtful, but I've already arranged for catering. And honestly, there's so much food here that I'm not sure how we could serve it all, or whether it will complement what I've already planned." "Oh, don't worry about the catering," I said with apparent enthusiasm. "I'm sure your friends will prefer homemade food to whatever commercial preparation you ordered. These recipes are very special. Some of them have been in development for years, and I think your book club will really appreciate the authentic, artisanal approach." The look of panic that crossed Vanessa's face was exactly what I had been hoping to observe. She was faced with a situation where rejecting my contributions would seem ungrateful and potentially hurtful, but accepting them would disrupt her carefully planned event and force her to serve food that she hadn't tested or approved to guests whose opinions were important to her professionally and socially. "Eleanor, I appreciate the effort, but some of these dishes seem quite rich and complex. Are you sure they're appropriate for a casual book discussion? And honestly, I'm not sure all of my friends have adventurous palates." "Nonsense," I replied, with the confident tone of someone who believed their culinary expertise was unquestionable. "Good food is good food. Your friends will be impressed by the quality and sophistication of these preparations. Trust me, I know what people enjoy." Vanessa spent the next 3 hours trying to diplomatically manage the situation, attempting to find ways to incorporate some of my dishes while maintaining her original catering plans, rearranging her dining room to accommodate additional serving pieces, and explaining to her caterer why she needed to modify the original order at the last minute. When the book club members arrived that evening, I made sure to position myself prominently in the kitchen and dining areas, eager to explain each dish to the guests and receive their feedback about my culinary creations. "This appetizer features a reduction sauce that took 6 hours to prepare properly," I announced to a group of women who had been expecting a simple wine and cheese evening. "The flavor profile is designed to complement the tannins in the Cabernet Sauvignon, though it would also pair beautifully with a full-bodied Malbec, if you prefer something with more intensity." Quote, the book club members exchanged polite but clearly uncomfortable glances as I continued to provide detailed, technical explanations about ingredients, preparation methods, and serving suggestions that went far beyond what anyone had requested or wanted to hear. "The bread is made with a sourdough starter that I've been maintaining for over 30 years, I continued, apparently oblivious to their growing discomfort. "The fermentation process creates complex flavor compounds that you simply can't achieve with commercial yeast products. You'll notice the subtle tang and the particularly chewy texture of the crumb." Vanessa attempted to redirect the conversation toward the book they were supposed to be discussing, but I repeatedly interrupted with additional food-related commentary that made it impossible for the group to focus on their intended agenda. "Has everyone tried the dessert course? I used a European-style pastry technique that requires very specific temperature control and timing. Most commercial bakeries can't achieve this level of sophistication because they don't understand the chemistry involved in proper gluten development." By the end of the evening, several book club members had made polite excuses about early morning appointments and left significantly earlier than usual, clearly uncomfortable with the disruption to their normal meeting format and unwilling to endure more detailed culinary lectures. After the guests departed, Vanessa's attempt to address the situation with me provided crucial insight into her character and patience levels. "Eleanor, I know you meant well, but the book club meeting was quite different from what I had planned. My friends come to discuss literature and relax, not to learn about cooking techniques or food preparation methods." "But they seem so interested in the food," I replied with apparent confusion. Several of them asked questions about the recipes and preparation methods. I thought they genuinely wanted to learn about sophisticated cooking techniques. "Eleanor, they were being polite." When people ask questions about food at a dinner party, they're usually just making conversation, not requesting detailed technical explanations about cooking chemistry and fermentation processes. This conversation revealed Vanessa's growing frustration with my apparent inability to read social cues and understand appropriate boundaries in social situations. More importantly, it showed her increasing tendency to speak to me as if I were socially incompetent, rather than simply enthusiastic about sharing knowledge that I believed would be appreciated. The second major escalation occurred during David's law firm's quarterly client appreciation event, an elegant cocktail reception held at one of Seattle's most prestigious hotels. This event was crucial for David's career advancement, as it provided opportunities for partners to interact with major clients and demonstrate their firm's culture and professionalism. Vanessa had specifically asked me not to attend this event, explaining that it was primarily a business function rather than a social gathering, and suggesting that I might be more comfortable staying home with a nice dinner and a movie. However, I had misunderstood her suggestion and appeared at the hotel just as the reception was beginning, dressed appropriately but carrying a large container of homemade appetizers that I had prepared as my contribution to the evening. "Eleanor, what are you doing here?" David asked with obvious shock when he saw me approaching the registration table with my food container. "I brought some appetizers for your clients," I announced proudly. "I know how important this event is for your career, and I wanted to make sure the food was really exceptional. The hotel catering is probably adequate, but I thought your clients deserved something truly special." David's expression showed the complete panic of someone who realized that his elderly mother was about to disrupt one of the most important professional events of his year, with homemade food that hadn't been approved by the hotel's catering staff or tested for safety and quality standards. "Mom, you can't just bring outside food to a hotel event. There are health regulations and insurance requirements. And honestly, the catering has already been arranged and paid for." "Oh, don't worry about regulations," I said, with the dismissive confidence of someone who believed their good intentions trumped professional protocols. "This food is much higher quality than anything the hotel kitchen could produce. Your clients will appreciate the personal touch and the superior ingredients." Before David could stop me, I had approached several of his most important clients and began distributing my homemade appetizers while providing detailed explanations about the preparation methods and ingredient sourcing. "This is a duck liver mousse made with organic, free-range duck from a small farm in Skagit Valley," I explained to the senior partner of a major corporate client. "The preparation technique is French classical, but I've modified the seasoning profile to complement Pacific Northwest flavor preferences. You'll notice the subtle hints of hazelnut and dried cherry that reflect our regional culinary identity." The senior partner accepted my offering politely, but clearly didn't know how to respond to such detailed culinary information in what was supposed to be a casual business networking environment. I also brought some salmon preparations using traditional Native American smoking techniques combined with contemporary flavor enhancement, I continued, apparently unaware of his discomfort. "The fish is wild caught from the Columbia River, and the smoking process took 14 hours to achieve the proper texture and moisture content." David spent the entire evening attempting damage control, apologizing to clients for my unexpected appearance, explaining to hotel staff why there was unauthorized food being distributed at their event, and trying to redirect conversations away from culinary topics and back to legal matters and business relationships. The most telling moment came when I approached the managing partner of David's firm, a distinguished gentleman who controlled decisions about partnership advancement and client relationship management. "You must be David's boss," I said with apparent delight. "I'm so pleased to meet you. I brought some special appetizers tonight because I wanted your clients to experience really exceptional food rather than the usual hotel catering." "That's very thoughtful of you, Mrs. Morrison," he replied diplomatically, though I could see the concern in his eyes as he processed the implications of a junior partner's mother taking initiative to improve a carefully planned client event. "I hope David has told you about my background in the food industry," I continued with seemingly innocent pride. "I have quite a bit of experience with large-scale food service operations, and I couldn't help but notice some opportunities for improvement in your firm's catering choices." The managing partner's expression shifted to barely concealed alarm as he realized that David's mother was critiquing the firm's event planning decisions and implying that she had professional qualifications to assess their vendor relationships. I'd be happy to consult with your event planning team about upgrading your food service standards, I offered enthusiastically. Quality cuisine can be such an important factor in client satisfaction and retention. David appeared at my elbow within seconds, clearly having monitored my conversation with his boss and recognized the need for immediate intervention. Mom, I think Mr. Henderson needs to speak with some other clients now, he said with forced casualness while gently steering me away from the managing partner. The following Monday, David received a carefully worded conversation from the managing partner about the importance of maintaining professional boundaries at firm events and ensuring that family members understood appropriate conduct for business functions. That evening's discussion between David and Vanessa provided me with exactly the character assessment information I had been seeking. Eleanor, we need to talk about appropriate behavior at professional events, Vanessa began with the tone of someone who had been pushed beyond her normal patience levels. David's career depends on maintaining good relationships with clients and colleagues. When you bring outside food to hotel events or offer unsolicited business advice to senior partners, it creates problems that could affect his advancement opportunities. But I was just trying to help, I replied with apparent confusion. I thought providing better food would reflect well on David and show his clients that his family cares about quality and attention to detail. Eleanor, that's not how professional events work. There are protocols and expectations that you need to understand. When you don't follow those protocols, it makes David look like he can't manage his family responsibilities appropriately. This conversation revealed the core of Vanessa's concerns about my presence in their lives. She viewed my behavior as a threat to their social and professional standing, rather than considering whether my intentions might be positive, even if my methods were unconventional. The third major escalation occurred during the grandchildren's back-to-school night at their private academy, an event where parents toured classrooms, met teachers, and participated in discussions about curriculum and educational philosophy. Vanessa had specifically asked me to stay home, explaining that these events were designed for parents and guardians rather than extended family members. However, I appeared at the school just as the evening was beginning, carrying elaborate homemade treats for the teachers and detailed suggestions for improving the school's nutrition programs. Grandma Eleanor, what are you doing here? Asked 10-year-old Sophie when she saw me in the hallway outside her classroom. I brought some special treats for your teachers, I explained cheerfully, and I wanted to talk to them about some ideas for improving the school lunch program. I have quite a bit of experience with institutional food service, and I think there are some opportunities for enhancement. Vanessa appeared beside us almost immediately, her expression showing the familiar combination of panic and frustration that had become her standard response to my unexpected appearances at important events. Eleanor, I thought we agreed that you would stay home tonight. This is really just for parents and teachers to discuss curriculum matters. But I'm family too, I replied with apparently innocent confusion. And I have some valuable insights about nutrition and child development that I thought the teachers would appreciate. Good food is so important for learning and concentration. Before Vanessa could stop me, I had entered Sophie's classroom and begun distributing homemade cookies to her teacher while explaining my concerns about the school's food service operations. These cookies are made with organic ingredients and natural sweeteners that provide sustained energy rather than the blood sugar spikes you get from commercial baked goods. I explained to Sophie's teacher, who was clearly unprepared for detailed nutritional consultation during a routine parent-teacher conference. I've also prepared a comprehensive analysis of your school lunch menu with suggestions for improving the nutritional density and flavor profiles of the meals provided to students, I continued, producing a detailed written report from my handbag. The teacher accepted my materials politely but clearly didn't know how to respond to such extensive, unsolicited advice about school nutrition policies from a grandparent who wasn't even supposed to be present at the event. I noticed that your current food service provider is using quite a bit of processed ingredients and artificial additives, I continued. I'd be happy to recommend some alternative suppliers who could provide higher quality ingredients at competitive prices. Quote, Vanessa spent the remainder of the evening apologizing to teachers for my unexpected presence, explaining that I was going through some adjustments related to aging and attempting to collect the various food items and written materials I had distributed throughout the school. The most revealing moment came when I encountered the school's head of nutrition services, a professional nutritionist who managed food programs for the entire academy. You must be responsible for the meal planning here, I said with apparent delight when I was introduced to her. I'm so excited to meet you. I have extensive experience in institutional food service, and I've prepared some recommendations for improving your programs. That's very kind of you to take an interest, she replied diplomatically. Are you a nutrition professional yourself? I have quite a bit of hands-on experience with large-scale food operations, I replied ambiguously. I've been involved in restaurant management and food service development for many years. I think you'd find my insights valuable for upgrading your current systems. The nutrition director accepted my written recommendations politely, but I could see her confusion about why a grandparent was providing professional-level consultation about institutional food service operations. The conversation that followed between David and Vanessa when we returned home provided the most direct assessment of their character that I had yet received. Eleanor, tonight was completely inappropriate, Vanessa said with obvious anger that she was no longer attempting to disguise. You can't just show up at school events uninvited and start distributing food and advice to teachers and administrators. But I was just trying to help, I protested. The school's nutrition program has some serious deficiencies, and I thought my professional experience could be valuable for improving the children's educational environment. Eleanor, you don't have professional experience in school nutrition. You worked part-time at a restaurant that closed down. That doesn't qualify you to critique institutional food service operations or offer unsolicited advice to education professionals. This response revealed Vanessa's complete dismissal of my claimed expertise, and her assumption that my background was limited to the minimal employment history I had shared when I moved into their house. And even if you did have relevant experience, she continued, there are appropriate channels for providing input about school policies. You can't just appear at parent events and start distributing materials and making recommendations without going through proper procedures. David's response was even more telling about his character and priorities. Mom, Vanessa is right. Your behavior tonight was embarrassing for our family and inappropriate for the school environment. Sophie and Jake's teachers are going to remember this, and it could affect how they view our family's judgment and reliability. But I was just trying to help the children get better nutrition, I replied, with apparent confusion about why my good intentions were being criticized. Mom, the way you help isn't always helpful. Your intentions might be good, but your methods create problems for other people that you don't seem to understand or care about. This conversation revealed that both David and Vanessa viewed my behavior as fundamentally selfish and inconsiderate, regardless of my stated motivations. They interpreted my actions as attention-seeking rather than genuine attempts to contribute positively to situations I cared about. More importantly, their responses showed that they were prioritizing their social reputation and others' opinions over understanding why I might be behaving differently than they expected, or considering whether my apparent expertise might actually be legitimate rather than delusional. The final escalation of this testing period occurred during Vanessa's charity fundraising gala, an annual event she had been organizing for 3 years to benefit a local women's shelter. This event was crucial to her standing in Seattle's philanthropic community and represented months of careful planning and relationship building with major donors and community leaders. 2 days before the gala, I announced that I had taken the initiative to upgrade the catering arrangements by contacting the venue directly and arranging for additional food stations featuring my own recipes and preparation methods. Eleanor, what do you mean you contacted the venue? Vanessa asked with obvious alarm when I shared this news during breakfast. I called the catering manager and explained that I wanted to provide some supplementary food options that would really impress your donors, I replied proudly. I have some signature dishes that I think will elevate the entire event and show your supporters how much thought and care went into every detail. Vanessa's face went completely white as she processed the implications of my unauthorized intervention in her carefully planned fundraising event. Eleanor, you can't just call the venue and change the catering arrangements. There are contracts, budgets, and approval processes. And I have no idea what you've committed us to, or how much it's going to cost. Oh, don't worry about the cost, I said dismissively. I've arranged everything directly with the kitchen staff. They were very excited about the opportunity to prepare some really sophisticated dishes instead of the usual banquet fare. The next 2 days were a nightmare for Vanessa as she attempted to understand what I had arranged, coordinate with the venue's catering staff about accommodating my additions, and modify her budget to account for unexpected food costs that I had apparently committed her to without authorization. The night of the gala, I appeared in the venue's kitchen 3 hours before the event was scheduled to begin, carrying multiple containers of ingredients and detailed preparation instructions for the culinary team. "I'm here to oversee the preparation of the special dishes I arranged," I announced to the confused catering manager. "These recipes require very specific techniques and timing, so I'll need to work directly with your kitchen staff to ensure everything meets my quality standards." The catering manager, who had been expecting to implement a standard banquet service for 200 guests, suddenly found himself trying to accommodate a demanding elderly woman who claimed authority to direct his professional kitchen staff in the preparation of dishes he had never seen before. "Ma'am, we have a very tight schedule tonight, and our team has already prepared for the original menu. I'm not sure we can accommodate additional dishes without disrupting our entire service timeline." "Nonsense," I replied with the confident authority of someone who believed their culinary expertise was unquestionable. "Good organization and proper technique can handle any menu complexity. I've been managing large-scale food operations for decades, and I know exactly how to coordinate multiple preparation streams efficiently." Quote, "For the next 3 hours, I directed the catering staff through the preparation of 6 additional courses, correcting their techniques, adjusting their seasoning, and insisting on presentation standards that far exceeded the venue's normal banquet requirements." When the guests arrived for Vanessa's gala, they encountered a dramatically expanded menu that bore no resemblance to what had been advertised in the event materials, served by catering staff who were clearly stressed and behind schedule due to the last-minute additions I had imposed on their service plan. "Vanessa, this food is absolutely extraordinary," commented one of the major donors. "I had no idea you had arranged for such sophisticated cuisine. Where did you find this catering team?" "Actually, my mother-in-law, Eleanor, prepared several of these dishes herself," Vanessa replied with forced enthusiasm, clearly unsure whether to take credit for my contributions or distance herself from the disruption I had caused. "Your mother-in-law is quite talented," the donor continued. "Has she worked in the restaurant industry? These preparation techniques are definitely professional level." "She has some experience with food service," Vanessa replied diplomatically, though I could see her confusion about how to explain my apparent expertise without encouraging further questions about my background. The evening was ultimately successful in terms of fundraising results, but the stress and uncertainty I had created for Vanessa revealed everything I needed to know about how she handled situations where I took initiative without her permission or oversight. The conversation that followed the next morning provided the final evidence I needed about their character and attitude toward my role in their family. "Eleanor, what you did with the catering was completely unacceptable," Vanessa said with barely controlled anger. "You had no right to contact the venue, change the menu, or commit us to additional expenses without my knowledge or permission." "But the event was a huge success," I protested. Everyone commented on how exceptional the food was, and several donors mentioned that the quality of the catering reflected well on the organization and your attention to detail. "Eleanor, that's not the point. You can't just take over other people's projects and make major changes without consultation. What if your additions had been terrible? What if they had created problems with the venue or the budget? I would have been responsible for cleaning up a mess that you created without my knowledge." David's response was even more direct about their fundamental attitude toward my presence in their lives. "Mom, you seem to think that good intentions justify any behavior, regardless of how it affects other people. But being part of a family means respecting other people's responsibilities and boundaries, not taking over their projects because you think you can do them better." This conversation confirmed that both David and Vanessa viewed me as fundamentally selfish and controlling, regardless of the positive outcomes my interventions had produced. They were more concerned about my failure to follow their preferred processes than they were interested in the value I had contributed to events that were important to them. By the end of the second month, I had comprehensive evidence about how David and Vanessa treated elderly family members whose behavior challenged their control and social comfort. They had demonstrated impatience, condescension, and a fundamental lack of respect for my autonomy and judgment, even when my actions produced positive results. Most importantly, they had revealed that their primary concern was maintaining their social reputation and professional standing, rather than understanding or appreciating the contributions I was trying to make to their family's success and happiness. The stage was now set for the final phase of testing that would push them to make the ultimate choice about how they viewed my role in their lives, and whether they valued family loyalty over social convenience. But if you really want to understand how Vanessa reached the breaking point that led to her fateful declaration that I should eat my meals in my room, you need to know about the events of October 18th, the day I decided to escalate my performance to a level that would force her to reveal her true character once and for all. It was the day I created what appeared to be a genuine food-related crisis that would test every assumption they had made about my condition and every strategy they had developed for managing my behavior. October 18th began like any other morning during my 4-month residency in David and Vanessa's home. I woke up at 5 a.m., as I had every day since arriving. But this time, I had a specific plan that would push their patience and assumptions to the breaking point. Today would be the day that Vanessa and David would be forced to confront exactly how far they were willing to go to control someone they believed was no longer capable of making appropriate decisions about food and social behavior. I started the morning by creating what appeared to be the most dramatic food-related incident yet. At 6 a.m., while the family was still sleeping, I began preparing what looked like an elaborate Thanksgiving-style feast in their kitchen, using every available pot, pan, and cooking surface to create a massive meal that seemed completely inappropriate for a regular Tuesday morning in October. When Vanessa discovered me at 7 a.m., surrounded by the chaos of industrial-scale food preparation, her reaction was immediate and intense. "Eleanor, what in the world are you doing?" she asked, staring at the kitchen that had been transformed into what looked like a commercial restaurant during the breakfast rush. "I'm preparing a special meal," I replied, allowing my voice to sound slightly manic and disconnected from reality. "I realized that we haven't had a proper family feast since I moved in, and I wanted to create something really memorable for everyone." Vanessa looked around the kitchen in horror. Every surface was covered with bowls, ingredients, and cooking implements. The stove had 6 burners going simultaneously, the oven was full of dishes I couldn't identify, and the counters were covered with what appeared to be enough food to feed 30 people. "Eleanor, it's Tuesday morning. The children need to get ready for school, David needs to get to work, and I have meetings all day. We don't have time for a family feast, and honestly, this is way too much food for our family." "But I wanted to show everyone how much I care," I said, continuing to stir multiple pots while appearing increasingly agitated and confused. "Food is how you show love, and I've been feeling like maybe you don't think I contribute enough to this household." The look of panic that crossed Vanessa's face was exactly what I had been hoping to observe. She was faced with a kitchen disaster that would take hours to clean up, a massive amount of food that couldn't possibly be consumed, and an elderly family member who appeared to be having some kind of emotional breakdown related to food and family dynamics. "Eleanor, you contribute plenty to our household, but this is too much. We can't possibly eat all this food, and I don't understand why you started cooking at 6 a.m. without telling anyone." "I wanted it to be a surprise," I replied, tears beginning to form in my eyes. "I thought everyone would be happy to have a really special breakfast together, but maybe you're right. Maybe I don't understand what this family wants from me." David appeared in the kitchen doorway just as I was reaching what appeared to be a complete emotional breakdown, sobbing over multiple pots of food while Vanessa tried to figure out how to manage the situation without being late for work or causing the children to be late for school. "Mom, what's going on here?" David asked, taking in the scene with obvious shock and confusion. "I was trying to make a special meal for everyone," I said through apparent tears. "But Vanessa doesn't seem to want it, and now I don't know what to do with all this food. I've been working for hours, and I just wanted to do something nice for the family." David and Vanessa exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared assessment that this situation represented a serious escalation of my food-related behavioral problems. "Mom, it's very thoughtful of you to want to cook for the family, but this is an enormous amount of food, and Tuesday morning isn't really the right time for a big family meal. Everyone has work and school commitments." "But when is the right time?" I asked, appearing genuinely confused and distressed. "You're all always busy, and I never know when I'm allowed to use the kitchen or how much food is appropriate. I thought if I made something really special, we could all sit down together and have a proper family meal." Quote. The children appeared in the kitchen at this point, attracted by the sounds of conversation and the unusual smells of extensive cooking. Their reactions provided additional evidence about how my behavior was affecting the entire household dynamic. "Grandma Eleanor, why is there so much food?" asked 12-year-old Jake, staring at the kitchen in amazement. "And why are you crying?" added 10-year-old Sophie, clearly concerned about the emotional intensity of the scene they had walked into. "I was trying to make a special breakfast for everyone," I explained to the children, continuing to appear upset and confused. "But I think I made too much food, and now your parents are worried about the mess and the time it will take to eat everything." Vanessa was now faced with the additional challenge of managing the children's confusion and concern, while dealing with what appeared to be my emotional crisis and the practical problem of a kitchen full of food that needed to be addressed before anyone could proceed with their normal Tuesday routines. "Children, why don't you go get dressed for school while we figure out what to do with all this food," she said, trying to maintain calm while clearly feeling overwhelmed by the situation. "But I want to try some of Grandma's food," Sophie protested. "It smells really good, and she worked so hard on it." This created an additional layer of complexity for Vanessa, as rejecting my food contributions now appeared to be disappointing the children and potentially hurting my feelings in front of witnesses who would remember how the situation was handled. "Of course we'll try some of the food," David said diplomatically, "but we need to figure out how to manage this much food when everyone has places to be this morning." "Maybe we could pack some for lunch," Sophie suggested innocently, "and maybe save some for dinner tonight." "That's a wonderful idea, sweetheart," I said, immediately brightening at the suggestion. "I could pack special lunches for everyone with some of these dishes. And tonight we could have a proper family dinner with some of the other preparations." Vanessa's expression showed her growing realization that what had started as a morning crisis was now expanding into expectations that would affect the entire day and potentially the rest of the week. Over the next 2 hours, she was forced to completely reorganize her schedule to accommodate my food crisis. She had to call her office to explain that she would be late for meetings, help pack elaborate lunches for the children using my homemade dishes, coordinate with David about storing the excess food, and find diplomatic ways to handle the massive quantities of prepared food that couldn't possibly be consumed before spoiling. The most telling aspect of her response was how she spoke to me during this crisis management process. Her tone became increasingly sharp and controlled, as if she were dealing with a child who had created a mess that adults now had to clean up. "Eleanor, in the future, please discuss meal planning with me before starting any major cooking projects. This much food requires advanced planning and coordination with everyone's schedules." "But I wanted it to be a surprise," I protested, still appearing confused about why my good intentions had created problems. "Eleanor, surprises need to be appropriate for the situation. A surprise should make things easier and more pleasant for everyone, not create additional work and stress." The second major incident of October 18th occurred at David's office, where I appeared unexpectedly during the lunch hour carrying elaborate homemade meals for his entire legal team. "Mom, what are you doing here?" David asked with obvious alarm when I appeared in the reception area of his law firm carrying multiple large containers of food. "I brought lunch for everyone," I announced proudly to the receptionist and anyone else within hearing distance. "I made some special preparations this morning, and I thought your colleagues would enjoy something more interesting than their usual lunch options." David's face went completely white as he realized that his elderly mother had appeared at his workplace uninvited, carrying homemade food for distribution to his professional colleagues, without any advance warning or permission. "Mom, you can't just bring food to my office. There are health regulations and professional protocols, and honestly, most people have already made lunch plans. But this food is much better than anything they could get from restaurants or cafeterias," I replied with apparent confusion about why my offering wasn't being appreciated. "I used premium ingredients and professional preparation techniques. Your colleagues deserve to experience really exceptional cuisine." Quote. Before David could stop me, I had approached the managing partner's office and knocked on his door to offer him one of my homemade lunch containers. "Mr. Henderson, I'm David Morrison's mother, Eleanor. I brought some special lunch preparations today, and I wanted to make sure you had first choice of the options." The managing partner, who had been in the middle of an important conference call, found himself confronted by David's elderly mother offering unsolicited food while his junior associate stood behind her, looking mortified. "That's very thoughtful of you, Mrs. Morrison," he replied diplomatically, though I could see his confusion about why David's mother was distributing food in the office without advance coordination with anyone. "This container has braised short ribs with a red wine reduction that took 8 hours to prepare properly," I explained enthusiastically. "And this one has pan-seared salmon with a citrus compound butter that I developed specifically for Pacific Northwest flavor preferences." The managing partner accepted one of my containers politely, but I could see his concern about the professional implications of a junior partner's mother taking initiative to provide meals for the entire firm without going through appropriate channels. "I hope you'll share your feedback with David," I continued cheerfully. "I'm very interested in how the flavors work for professional palates, and I'd be happy to adjust the recipes based on preferences and suggestions." David appeared at my elbow almost immediately, clearly having monitored my conversation with his boss and recognized the need for immediate damage control. "Mr. Henderson, I'm so sorry about this interruption. Mom, we should probably let Mr. Henderson get back to his work." "Of course," I replied agreeably. "But I do hope you'll try the food and let me know what you think. I'm always looking for ways to improve my preparations." As David guided me away from his boss's office, I made sure to distribute my remaining food containers to other attorneys and staff members throughout the firm, providing each recipient with detailed explanations about ingredients, preparation methods, and serving suggestions. "This pasta dish features a sauce made with San Marzano tomatoes and fresh herbs from my own garden," I explained to one of David's colleagues. "The pasta is made fresh using a technique I learned from traditional Italian cooks, and the cheese is imported from a specific region in Tuscany that produces exceptional aging characteristics." The attorneys and staff members accepted my offerings politely, but I could see their confusion about why David's mother was providing detailed culinary education during their normal workday activities. "I also brought some dessert options," I continued, producing additional containers from my seemingly endless supply. "These are individual chocolate soufflés that need to be consumed within 2 hours of preparation for optimal texture and flavor development." By the time I finished distributing food throughout David's office, nearly every employee had received elaborate homemade meals along with detailed preparation explanations that went far beyond normal social interaction. The conversation that David had with me as he escorted me from the building provided crucial insight into his character and priorities. "Mom, you cannot show up at my office unannounced and start distributing food to my colleagues. This is a professional environment, and there are appropriate ways to interact with my coworkers." "But I was just trying to do something nice for the people you work with," I protested. "Good food builds relationships and shows that you care about quality and attention to detail." "Mom, my relationships with my colleagues are based on professional competence and reliability, not on whether my mother brings them homemade lunch. When you do things like this, it makes me look like I can't maintain appropriate boundaries between my family life and my work responsibilities." This response revealed David's primary concern about my behavior. He was worried about how my actions reflected on his professional image, rather than considering whether my intentions might be positive or my food contributions actually valuable. The third escalation of October 18th occurred when I appeared at Sophie's school during lunchtime, claiming that I had special permission to provide alternative lunch options for children who might be interested in more nutritious and flavorful alternatives to the standard cafeteria offerings. "Mrs. Morrison, we weren't expecting you today," said the school's nutritionist when I appeared in the cafeteria carrying multiple containers of elaborate children's meals. "I spoke with someone in the office about providing some alternative lunch options," I replied ambiguously, allowing the staff to assume that I had received proper authorization for my visit. I thought some of the children might enjoy experiencing more sophisticated flavors and higher quality ingredients. Before anyone could verify my claimed permission, I had begun distributing my homemade children's meals to students throughout the cafeteria, explaining to each child about the ingredients and preparation methods I had used. "This is a deconstructed chicken pot pie with organic vegetables and free-range chicken," I explained to a table of third graders. "The pastry is made with European butter and heritage wheat flour that creates a more complex flavor profile than regular commercial preparations." The children were delighted by the unusual and sophisticated food options, but the cafeteria staff was clearly confused about why an unauthorized adult was distributing homemade food to students without following proper safety protocols and administrative approvals. And this is a miniature beef bourguignon adapted for young palates, I continued, moving to another table. The meat is braised in a child-friendly wine reduction that concentrates the flavors while eliminating the alcohol content. By the time the school administration realized what was happening, I had provided elaborate gourmet meals to over 40 students, while conducting impromptu nutrition education sessions about ingredient quality, cooking techniques, and flavor development. Mrs. Morrison, we need to speak with you about proper procedures for outside food in our school, said the assistant principal when she finally tracked me down in the cafeteria. Of course, I replied cheerfully. I'm very interested in working with your nutrition team to upgrade the overall food program. These children deserve much better than the processed, institutional food they're currently receiving. The assistant principal's expression showed her growing concern about an unauthorized adult who was critiquing the school's food service operations while distributing unapproved meals to students. Mrs. Morrison, any outside food brought into the school needs to be approved in advance through our administration and health services. We have strict policies about food safety and dietary restrictions that we need to follow. Quote, but this food meets much higher safety and quality standards than your regular cafeteria offerings, I protested. I used only premium ingredients and professional preparation techniques. These children are getting a much better nutritional experience than they would with your usual processed food. The conversation that followed revealed the school's growing concern about my apparent inability to understand appropriate boundaries and protocols for interacting with educational institutions and their students. When Vanessa received the phone call from the school asking her to come in for a discussion about my unauthorized food distribution, her response provided the most direct assessment of her patience and tolerance levels that I had yet received. Eleanor, I just got a call from Sophie's school asking me to come in because you distributed homemade food to students without permission, she said when she confronted me that evening. But the children loved the food, I replied defensively. Several of them said it was the best lunch they'd ever had at school, and some of them asked for recipes to take home to their parents. Eleanor, that's not the point. You can't just go to schools and start feeding children without following proper procedures. There are health regulations, allergy considerations, and administrative protocols that exist for good reasons. But those regulations are designed for processed commercial food operations. This was home cooking using premium ingredients and proper safety techniques. Vanessa's response revealed her fundamental attitude toward my judgment and decision-making capabilities. Eleanor, you don't get to decide which regulations apply to you based on your personal assessment of your food quality. Rules exist for everyone, regardless of their individual circumstances or intentions. The final and most dramatic incident of October 18th occurred that evening, when I created what appeared to be a complete emotional breakdown, triggered by the family's rejection of my food contributions and their criticism of my attempts to share my culinary knowledge with their community. During dinner, as the family was eating the regular meal that Vanessa had prepared using her normal recipes and ingredients, I began what appeared to be an increasingly agitated critique of the food quality and preparation methods. This chicken is quite dry, I commented, poking at my serving with apparent disappointment. The cooking temperature was probably too high, and the timing wasn't properly adjusted for the size of the pieces. Eleanor, the chicken is fine, Vanessa replied with forced patience. Everyone else seems to be enjoying their dinner. And the vegetables are overcooked, I continued, appearing to become more upset as I examined each component of the meal. They've lost their nutritional value and most of their flavor. With just a few simple technique adjustments, this could have been a much more satisfying meal. David attempted to redirect the conversation away from food criticism, but I continued to appear increasingly distressed about what I characterized as the family's acceptance of mediocre food quality. I don't understand why everyone is satisfied with such basic preparation when it would be so easy to create something truly exceptional, I said, my voice beginning to rise with apparent emotional intensity. Eleanor, not every meal needs to be, quote, exceptional, Vanessa replied, her tone becoming sharper as her patience wore thin. Sometimes people just want to eat dinner without detailed analysis of cooking techniques and ingredient quality. But why would you settle for just okay when you could have something wonderful? I asked, appearing genuinely confused and upset by their apparent lack of interest in culinary excellence. Because some of us have other priorities besides food, Vanessa snapped, finally losing the diplomatic tone she had been maintaining. Some of us care about things like work, family relationships, and social responsibilities that don't revolve around cooking techniques and ingredient sourcing. This response triggered what appeared to be my complete emotional breakdown about my role in the family and their attitude toward my contributions and expertise. "So you think my knowledge and experience are worthless," I said, tears beginning to stream down my face. "You think I'm just a burden who creates problems and doesn't understand how to behave appropriately." "Eleanor, that's not what I said," Vanessa replied, though her tone suggested that my interpretation wasn't entirely inaccurate. "But it's what you meant," I continued, appearing increasingly distraught. "You think I'm an embarrassing old woman who doesn't know her place and creates problems for your perfect family life." Quote. The children were now watching this exchange with obvious distress, clearly upset by the emotional intensity and conflict that had erupted during what was supposed to be a normal family dinner. "Grandma Eleanor, we love your cooking," Sophie said tearfully. "Don't be sad about the food." "And we liked the lunch you brought to school," Jake added, trying to comfort me while clearly not understanding the adult conflicts that were underlying this conversation. "Thank you, darlings," I said, continuing to cry while reaching out to hug both children. "At least someone in this family appreciates what I was trying to do." David was now faced with the challenge of managing what appeared to be a complete family crisis, triggered by food-related conflicts and his mother's apparent emotional breakdown about her role and value in the household. "Mom, of course we appreciate what you're trying to do, but there have to be some boundaries and appropriate ways to express your interest in food and cooking." "What boundaries?" I asked, appearing genuinely confused and hurt. "Boundaries about caring? Boundaries about trying to contribute to the family? Boundaries about sharing knowledge and experience that I've spent decades developing?" Vanessa's response to this question provided the clearest statement yet of her fundamental attitude toward my presence in their household. "Eleanor, boundaries about understanding that other people have different priorities and preferences than you do. Boundaries about respecting other people's spaces and responsibilities. Boundaries about understanding that your way of doing things isn't automatically better than everyone else's way." "So I should just be quiet and invisible," I said, appearing devastated by her characterization of appropriate behavior. "I should eat whatever food you provide, stay out of everyone's way, and never offer any input or assistance based on my experience and knowledge." "Eleanor, that's not what I'm saying," Vanessa replied, though her tone suggested that my summary wasn't entirely wrong. "But it is what you're saying," I continued. "You want me to be grateful for your generosity and never do anything that might inconvenience you or require you to adjust your routines or preferences." Quote. The conversation continued in this emotional pattern for another 30 minutes, with me appearing increasingly distraught about the family's rejection of my contributions and their apparent view of me as a burden rather than a valuable family member with knowledge and experience worth sharing. By the end of the evening, both David and Vanessa were clearly exhausted by the emotional intensity and practical complications of what had started as a food-related incident and had escalated into what appeared to be a fundamental crisis about my role in the family and their willingness to accommodate elderly relatives whose behavior didn't match their expectations. That night, after I had supposedly gone to bed, I listened to David and Vanessa's conversation about the day's events and their growing certainty that immediate action was required to address what they saw as my increasingly problematic behavior and emotional instability. "Vanessa, we can't continue like this," David said, his voice filled with exhaustion and stress. "Mom's behavior is affecting our work, the children's school, and our entire family dynamic. Today was completely out of control. David, I've been patient and I've tried to be understanding, but your mother's food obsessions are taking over our entire lives. Every conversation becomes about cooking techniques, every meal becomes a critique session, and now she's showing up at our workplaces and the children's school without permission. I know you're right, but I don't know what to do about it. When I try to set boundaries, she acts like we're rejecting her completely and becomes emotional in front of the children. David, the emotional manipulation is part of the problem. She uses tears and hurt feelings to avoid taking responsibility for inappropriate behavior. And the children are starting to think that we're being mean to their grandmother when we try to maintain normal household routines." Their conversation revealed that October 18th had achieved exactly what I had intended it to achieve. David and Vanessa were no longer debating whether my behavior was occasionally inappropriate. They were convinced that my food-related obsessions represented a serious threat to their family's stability and their ability to maintain normal professional and social relationships. Over the next few days, Vanessa accelerated her research into strategies for managing elderly family members with behavioral problems and began making concrete plans for addressing what she saw as my inability to understand appropriate boundaries and social expectations. Most tellingly, these plans were made without any meaningful consultation with me about my perspectives, needs, or feelings regarding their assessment of my behavior. David and Vanessa had decided that I was no longer competent to participate in decisions about managing my own conduct, and they were proceeding with interventions that they believed were necessary for the family's welfare, regardless of what I might want or need. The October 18th crisis had accomplished everything I had planned. It had forced David and Vanessa to reveal their true attitudes about elderly family members whose behavior challenged their control and social comfort. It had demonstrated their willingness to prioritize their own convenience over understanding or accommodating different approaches to food, family, and social interaction. And it had pushed them to the point where they were ready to take definitive action that would reveal their character once and for all. Because 5 days later, on October 23rd, Vanessa would make the declaration that would trigger the revelation that would change all of their lives forever. "Eleanor, you eat too much and it's embarrassing when we have guests over. Maybe you should consider eating your meals in your room from now on." And that was the moment when 4 months of careful planning and strategic performance would pay off in ways that Vanessa and David could never have imagined possible. October 23rd arrived with the crisp autumn air that made Seattle's fall season so beautiful. But inside David and Vanessa's house, the atmosphere was heavy with the tension of a decision that had been building for weeks. Vanessa had spent the morning preparing for what she believed would be a difficult but necessary conversation about my future behavior, while I had spent those same hours preparing for the revelation that would destroy every assumption they had made about their family dynamics, their financial security, and their understanding of who I really was. At 6 p.m., Vanessa asked me to join her and David in the dining room for what she described as an important family discussion. I could see that she had prepared for this moment. She had printed out several articles about elderly eating disorders and behavioral management, along with a folder of information about adult day programs and senior counseling services. David sat beside Vanessa at their polished mahogany dining table, his expression showing the conflict between duty to his mother and support for his wife's assessment of our situation. The children had been sent to spend the evening with friends, ensuring that this conversation would happen without witnesses who might be upset by the discussion of my apparent behavioral problems. "Eleanor," Vanessa began, her voice taking on the carefully modulated tone she had perfected for delivering difficult news to someone she believed had limited cognitive abilities. "David and I have been thinking about your eating habits and social behavior, and we're concerned that some changes might be necessary for everyone's well-being." I nodded attentively, playing the role of the confused but compliant elderly woman who was grateful for their guidance and concerned about their well-being. "Of course, dear. I know I've been causing problems for the family." "You're not causing problems, Mom," David said quickly, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "But we're worried that some of your behaviors around food and social situations might be creating challenges that we need to address." Vanessa leaned forward, her expression earnest and sympathetic. "Eleanor, we've been researching eating behaviors in elderly individuals, and there are some patterns in your conduct that suggest you might benefit from some professional guidance about appropriate portion sizes and social boundaries around food." Quote, I allowed my expression to show confusion and fear, as if I didn't fully understand what they were suggesting. "Professional guidance? I don't understand what you mean." "Eleanor," Vanessa said, her voice becoming more direct as she realized this conversation was going to require clear, explicit language. "Your relationship with food has become problematic in ways that are affecting our entire family's social and professional relationships." I stared at Vanessa for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "Are you saying you don't want me to eat with the family anymore?" "It's not about what we want, Eleanor," Vanessa replied, her patience already beginning to fray. "It's about what's appropriate and healthy for someone in your situation. Your eating habits and food-related behaviors have become disruptive to our household routines and embarrassing in social situations." "Embarrassing," I repeated slowly as if testing the word. "You think I'm embarrassing?" Eleanor, when you take excessive portions at dinner parties, when you critique other people's cooking, when you show up at workplaces and schools with unauthorized food, yes, it creates embarrassing situations that reflect poorly on our family's judgment and social awareness. David shifted uncomfortably, caught between his loyalty to Vanessa and his guilt about the decision they were making. Mom, we're not trying to hurt your feelings, but your behavior around food has become excessive. The incidents this week at my office and Sophie's school were completely inappropriate. Inappropriate, I said quietly, because I was trying to share good food with people I care about? Mom, it's not about the food quality. It's about boundaries and appropriate social behavior. You can't just show up at places uninvited and start distributing homemade food to people without following proper procedures. I appeared to consider this information carefully, as if I were trying to understand concepts that were beyond my cognitive abilities. So you think I don't understand how to behave properly? Eleanor, Vanessa said with forced patience, we think you need some help understanding appropriate boundaries around food and social situations. Your behavior suggests that you might be experiencing some age-related changes that are affecting your judgment about what's acceptable in different contexts. Age-related changes, I repeated. You think there's something wrong with my mind? We think you might benefit from speaking with professionals who specialize in helping elderly individuals maintain appropriate social behaviors and healthy relationships with food, David said carefully. I nodded slowly, appearing to absorb the impact of their assessment while actually preparing for the moment that would change everything. Eleanor, Vanessa continued, we've also been thinking that it might be better for everyone if you took your meals separately from the family for a while. Your eating habits and food commentary are making dinner time stressful for everyone, including the children. These words, the suggestion that I should eat alone because my presence was too disruptive for family meals, were exactly what I had been waiting to hear. Vanessa had finally revealed her true attitude about my worth as a family member and my right to participate in the basic activities that define family life. You want me to eat my meals in my room? I asked, allowing my voice to sound small and hurt. Eleanor, you eat too much and it's embarrassing when we have guests over. Maybe you should consider eating your meals in your room from now on, Vanessa said, her voice carrying the finality of someone who had exhausted her patience with negotiation and was now simply announcing a decision that had already been made. Those words, you eat too much and it's embarrassing, contained everything I needed to hear. Vanessa had revealed her fundamental attitude about aging, about family responsibility, and about the value of elderly people who she believed had become social liabilities rather than family members deserving of respect and inclusion. I sat quietly for a moment, appearing to absorb the devastating impact of Vanessa's declaration, while actually savoring the perfect setup she had just provided for the revelation that would change all of their lives. Vanessa, I said finally, my voice still soft but with a subtle change in tone that neither of them noticed. Before I agree to eat my meals in isolation, could I show you something? Something that might affect your understanding of my relationship with food and my role in this family. Vanessa and David exchanged glances that suggested they were prepared for emotional manipulation, tearful pleading, or desperate attempts to avoid the consequences of my apparent behavioral problems. Of course, Eleanor, Vanessa said with forced patience. What would you like to show us? I stood up slowly, using the careful movements of someone who appeared frail and uncertain, and walked to the kitchen counter where I had placed a simple business card earlier that evening. I returned to the dining room and sat down across from Vanessa and David, holding the card in my lap. Vanessa, David, I need to share some information with you that might change how you think about my eating habits, my knowledge of food service operations, and my ability to make appropriate decisions about my own behavior. I placed the business card on the dining table between us, positioning it so that the company name and title were clearly visible. The silence that followed was absolute and profound. Vanessa stared at the business card for what felt like several minutes, her eyes moving from the header to my name to the title that read Eleanor Catherine Morrison, founder and CEO, Morrison's Family Kitchens. Eleanor, she whispered finally, what is this? This is my business card, Vanessa. My actual business card, showing my position as the founder and CEO of Morrison's Family Kitchens. the restaurant chain that owns 37 locations across Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. David leaned forward to examine the card, his face showing complete bewilderment as he tried to process what he was seeing. "Mom, this says you're the CEO of Morrison's Family Kitchens. That can't be right. Morrison's is one of the largest restaurant chains in the Northwest." "Actually, David, Morrison's Family Kitchens currently operates 37 locations and employs over 2,400 people. We generated $127 million in revenue last year, and we're projected to exceed $150 million this year." I reached into my purse and withdrew additional documents: corporate financial statements, property deeds, business licenses, and industry awards that documented 45 years of building one of the most successful restaurant empires in the Pacific Northwest. "This is impossible," Vanessa said, her voice barely audible. "You told us you worked part-time at a restaurant that closed down. You said you were having financial difficulties and needed to stay with family." "Vanessa, I have never worked part-time for anyone in my entire adult life. I have never experienced financial difficulties that would require me to depend on family charity. And I certainly have never lived in a rental apartment subject to someone else's pricing decisions." Quote, I spread out more documents across the dining table: detailed business plans, expansion strategies, supplier contracts, and professional correspondence that revealed the scope of my business operations and industry influence. "I have been testing your character by pretending to have food-related behavioral problems that don't exist. Every instance of apparent social inappropriate behavior, every moment of seeming inability to understand boundaries, every crisis that required your patience and management was carefully planned to reveal how you treat elderly family members when you believe they're vulnerable and dependent." The effect of this revelation was immediate and devastating. Vanessa's face went completely white as she began to understand the magnitude of what I was telling her. "You've been pretending?" she whispered. "Vanessa, for the past 4 months, I have been conducting the most comprehensive assessment of your character and David's character that I could design. Every excessive portion, every inappropriate social comment, every boundary-crossing incident was strategically designed to test how you treat elderly family members when you believe they lack social awareness and self-control." I spread out more documents across the table, detailed notes I had kept about their conversations, their decisions, and their attitudes toward my apparent needs and limitations. I documented every conversation where you discussed my behavior without asking for my perspective. I recorded every instance where you spoke to me as if I were cognitively impaired rather than simply enthusiastic about food. I noted every decision you made about managing my conduct based on your assumptions about my limitations rather than consultation about my actual knowledge and experience. David was staring at the documents with an expression of total shock and growing horror as he began to realize what my revelations meant about his own behavior over the past 4 months. "Mom, are you saying that there's nothing wrong with your eating habits, that you don't have behavioral problems or social awareness issues?" "David, there is absolutely nothing wrong with my relationship with food or my understanding of social boundaries. I have been managing a sophisticated business empire that depends on my ability to assess food quality, understand customer preferences, and maintain professional relationships with suppliers, employees, and industry partners throughout the Pacific Northwest." Quote, I pulled out my phone, not the old flip phone Vanessa and David had seen me using, but a current model smartphone with advanced business applications, and showed them the property management and restaurant operations systems I used to oversee my business activities. "While you were discussing my apparent inability to understand appropriate portion sizes, I was actually conducting professional quality assessments of food service operations throughout the region. While you worried about my embarrassing behavior at social events, I was using those interactions to maintain industry connections and assess competitive positioning for my restaurant locations." Vanessa was reading through the corporate documents and financial statements with increasing devastation as she realized that the embarrassing old woman she had been planning to isolate from family meals was actually one of the most successful business leaders in the Pacific Northwest food industry. "But the inappropriate comments about restaurant operations," she said desperately, "the technical questions about cooking methods, the critiques of food service quality." "Vanessa, those weren't inappropriate comments from a confused elderly woman. They were professional assessments from someone who has spent 45 years developing expertise in every aspect of restaurant operations, from supplier relationships and kitchen management to customer service and quality control. The detailed knowledge of food costs and preparation techniques weren't signs of cognitive fixation. They were the routine observations of someone whose business success depends on understanding every element of food service operations better than my competitors do. I reached into my briefcase one final time and withdrew a document that I placed directly in front of Vanessa, a comprehensive analysis of the local restaurant market that I had prepared for potential investors. Vanessa, this is my most recent market analysis for the Seattle dining scene. It includes detailed assessments of 43 restaurant operations, including profitability projections, competitive positioning, and recommendations for strategic development. Vanessa's hands were shaking as she picked up the document and began reading. I watched her face change as she realized what the professional language and sophisticated analysis meant for her understanding of my capabilities and industry knowledge. According to this analysis, I continued, your favorite restaurant, the one where you celebrated your anniversary last month, is projected to fail within 18 months due to unsustainable cost structures and poor supplier relationships. The catering company you used for your charity gala is operating on margins so thin that they're likely to raise prices by 30% next year or go out of business entirely. Mom, this level of analysis, this isn't something you could just pick up from watching cooking shows or reading food magazines, David said weakly. David, this analysis is based on 45 years of professional experience in every aspect of restaurant development, operations, and market positioning. The inappropriate questions I asked at restaurants weren't the intrusive curiosity of a confused elderly woman. They were professional research conducted by someone who understands this industry better than most people who work in it. I began gathering the documents and returning them to my briefcase, preparing to leave their house for the final time. The most important thing you need to understand, I continued, is that every assumption you made about my capabilities, my social awareness, and my value as a family member was not just wrong. It was deliberately tested and found to reveal character flaws that disqualify you from the respect and financial support you believed you were entitled to receive. Where are you going? David asked, panic clear in his voice. I'm going home, David. To my luxury condominium in Seattle's most exclusive building, where I will continue managing my business operations and living independently as I have been doing successfully for the past 15 years. Eleanor, please, Vanessa said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Can't we talk about this? Can't we work something out? Vanessa, there is nothing to work out. You spent 4 months demonstrating how you treat elderly family members when you believe they're vulnerable and dependent. You revealed your character when you thought no one was keeping score. And that character doesn't deserve to benefit from the business relationships and industry connections you tried to manage through social embarrassment and isolation. But we were trying to help you, Vanessa protested. We thought you were having problems with food and social behavior. We thought we were doing what was best for you. Vanessa, you were doing what was most convenient for you. You never asked what I wanted or needed. You never consulted me about decisions that would affect my daily life and social participation. You treated me like a behavioral problem to be managed, rather than a family member to be respected and included. I stood up and walked toward the door, carrying my briefcase and the small suitcase I had arrived with 4 months earlier. Most importantly, Vanessa, when you believed I was vulnerable and unable to defend myself, you chose social convenience over family loyalty, reputation management over compassion, and control over acceptance. Those choices have consequences that you'll live with for the rest of your life. As I reached the front door, David made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Mom, please don't leave like this. We made mistakes, but we love you. Can't we start over and do better? I turned to face my son one last time. David, love doesn't isolate people because their enthusiasm embarrasses you. Love doesn't make major decisions about someone's daily life without their input or consent. Love doesn't prioritize social reputation over family acceptance and understanding. But I do love you, Mom. David, what you showed me over the past 4 months wasn't love. It was conditional tolerance disguised as family obligation, and social anxiety disguised as concern for my welfare. When you thought I couldn't challenge your decisions or defend my own interests, you revealed who you really are, and that person doesn't deserve the inheritance and business opportunities you assumed you would receive. I walked out of David and Vanessa's house carrying the same small suitcase I had arrived with 4 months earlier, but leaving behind a family whose assumptions about aging, respect, and family responsibility had just cost them access to a business empire they never knew existed. 3 hours later, I was back in my luxury condominium, resuming the business activities that had never actually stopped, and reviewing expansion opportunities that would increase my company's revenue and market presence even further over the coming years. 6 months later, I received a letter from David that showed he had finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. "Mom," he wrote, "I've spent every day since you left thinking about what kind of person I became during those 4 months. I realize now that I didn't just lose access to a business empire I never knew about. I lost my relationship with the most accomplished woman I've ever known because I was too arrogant and assumption-driven to see who you really were." David went on to explain that Vanessa had filed for divorce, unable to cope with the social and financial consequences of their treatment of me. He was working multiple jobs to maintain their house, had enrolled in business courses to understand the industry I had mastered, and was trying to become someone worthy of his children's respect. "I know I can never undo what I did or earn back your trust," he concluded, "but I want you to know that your lesson about assumptions and respect has changed how I think about family, aging, and the value of people whose capabilities might not be immediately obvious. I hope someday I can prove that I learned something valuable from the most expensive mistake I'll ever make." I never responded to David's letter, but I did establish a scholarship program at the University of Washington's School of Business for students studying hospitality management and food service operations, and I increased my mentorship activities with young entrepreneurs who were developing innovative approaches to restaurant operations and customer service. I also created a foundation that provides business development support for elderly entrepreneurs whose ideas and experience are overlooked by traditional investors who make assumptions about age and capability, rather than assessing actual knowledge and potential. 6 months after that, Morrison's Family Kitchens announced the opening of 5 new locations, each featuring innovative menu concepts and service approaches that reflected my continued involvement in every aspect of business development and strategic planning. Industry publications featured articles about my leadership philosophy and my approaches to maintaining quality standards while expanding operations across multiple markets. The business journals that covered my company's expansion never mentioned the 4 months I had spent testing my family's character, but the lessons I learned about respect, assumptions, and the treatment of elderly individuals influenced every aspect of my business practices and employee relations policies. Because sometimes the most important investments are the ones that teach people lessons they desperately need to learn, even when those lessons cost more than they ever imagined they could afford. The woman Vanessa thought was too embarrassing to eat with the family had taught her that respect isn't negotiable, dignity isn't conditional, and treating people well isn't dependent on what you think they can do for you in return. And the simple business card I left on their dining room table that October evening will serve as a permanent reminder that assumptions about people's worth based on age, eating habits, or apparent social awareness can be the most expensive mistakes you ever make, especially when the person you're underestimating has spent 70 years proving exactly how wrong those assumptions can be. This story is dedicated to every elderly person who has ever been dismissed, underestimated, or treated as an embarrassment by people who should have known better. Remember that age brings wisdom, experience, and often business acumen that younger people can't imagine. The most valuable lesson isn't about hidden wealth. It's about treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of what you think they can or cannot contribute to your social standing. If you or someone you know is experiencing elder abuse, social isolation, or family manipulation, resources are available through local adult protective services, elder law attorneys, and business advocacy organizations that specialize in protecting the rights and dignity of older entrepreneurs and business leaders. Age is not a limitation, it's an asset that deserves recognition and respect.